South Korea says it has seen indications that the North is preparing more missile launches, possibly an intercontinental ballistic missile. The South has carried out live fire exercises and says it is strengthening its missile defense system. The escalation follows North Korea's testing of a hydrogen nuclear bomb at the weekend, which it says can fit onto a long-range missile. The US has warned that any threat to itself or its allies will be met with massive military response. Our correspondent Robin Brandt reports from Seoul.
After the North's nuclear explosion underground, this from the South. A series of missile launches above ground. From land and from the air, South Korea's armed forces carried out a dummy raid early on Monday. It was designed to replicate an attack on North Korea's nuclear testing site. This was how North Koreans heard about the perfect success that was their nation's 6th nuclear missiles test on Sunday. It was more powerful than any before and came with claims that Kim Jong-un now has the ability to order a nuclear strike on mainland America. Fresh from briefing the President of the United States, America's Defense Secretary gave this very stark warning.
Any threat to the United States or its territories, including Guam, or our allies, will be met with a massive military response, a response both effective and overwhelming.
In the aftermath of this latest nuclear test, one of the most troubling things to emerge is evidence of a split between South Korea and the United States, its main security guarantor. And it came from, you've guessed it, a tweet. President Trump has attacked not just the North, but also his counterpart in the South, an ally. He criticised what he called South Korea's appeasement. Calling out your ally is not business as usual. But as things undoubtedly heat up here in Seoul, some think it's their president who has the right approach to cooling things down. It's our country's business, he said. I hope that he, President Trump, will refrain from making comments like that. This man said, about the appeasement, I think we need 2 tracks, sanctions and dialogue at the same time. The views of this man are very important. China's President Xi Jinping, North Korea's only ally. He had a summit of world leaders upset by the nuclear test. He and Russia's President Putin have promised to deal appropriately with their rogue neighbour. As the US reminds the world that nuclear weapons are an option here, the focus once again at an emergency UN meeting will be on sanctions, economic pressure. The talk now, though, here in South Korea is of beefing up the military options. With new evidence, the North may launch another missile test soon. The signs are this is becoming more about missiles than meetings. Robin Brandt, BBC News, Seoul.
Well, the UN Security Council will meet later today to discuss further sanctions against North Korea. And President Donald Trump has asked to be briefed on all available military options, according to his defence chief. Switzerland, with its long history of neutral diplomacy, has offered to help mediate. Richard Galpin looks at what options are now on the table.
With North Korea now believed to have developed a hydrogen bomb, Kim Jong-un could soon achieve his goal of possessing a credible nuclear arsenal capable of hitting the United States. It's left Donald Trump floundering, his threats of fire and fury failing to deter the North Korean regime from the course on which it's set. But he's still signalling a military response is possible.
Mr. President, will you attack North Korea?
At the same time, he's been lashing out at key allies, including South Korea, accusing it of being too soft in its approach to the crisis. And that could make today's meeting of the UN Security Council even more difficult. The aim of the discussions is to get agreement on imposing more sanctions. But already Russia's warning against this, saying it could break the North Korean economy. Amid the fractured diplomacy, one thing all sides agree on is that China could play the key role in preventing this crisis from leading to war. As North Korea's closest ally and trading partner, it has enormous leverage.
I think by far the best option would be for President Trump to sit down with President Xi of China and work out how they're going to control this unruly regime and country.
While China has cut some of its trade with North Korea, the United States and other world powers have been pressing Beijing to go much further. But today, the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman Geng Shuang announced its response to North Korea's nuclear test was to launch what it called stern negotiations with North Korean diplomats. No surprise then that countries in the region like Japan and South Korea continue to prepare for the worst, installing increasing numbers of defence systems to protect themselves from a North Korean missile strike. Attempts to defuse this crisis peacefully do continue, but the need for a breakthrough is becoming ever more urgent. Richard Galpin, BBC News.
In our central London studio is Dr. Jim Hoare, Associate Fellow in the Asia Programme at Chatham House and former diplomat who established the British Embassy in North Korea. Thank you very much for your time. Who's controlling this, I use the word game, because from the outside, someone somewhere is trying to play the other team off against themselves, aren't they?
Now, are you referring to the North Koreans or are you referring to the President of the United States?
That was my question, wasn't it?
I mean, I think part of the difficulty of assessing what's going on at the moment is not so much North Korea. North Korea has been on a trajectory to develop missiles and the means of delivering nuclear, it says nuclear weapons, but anyway, warheads, for some years. Hitherto, although very concerned about this, American presidents since the 1980s have ruled out the use of force, not because they think North Korea needs to be saved from itself, but because of the possible consequences for United States allies, South Korea and Japan. Now, the current President of the United States, no doubt, is aware of the past history, but makes these statements which are then handled by his advisors, but they're never, I think, never quite sure what the next statement will be. So there is a lot of confusion now about what the United States intends to do. Of course, it's got enormous firepower and it could strike at North Korea. But if it did, the consequences for the United States might be relatively limited. The consequences for North Korea's neighbours, the South Koreans and the Japanese, could be catastrophic. And for that, in the case of South Korea, there would be no need to use rockets. You could start just by artillery fire on Seoul. Seoul is very near the demilitarised zone, very vulnerable indeed.
On the diplomatic front, is the current President of the United States, if you like, paying for the inaction of his predecessors?
I think that's a bit of a simplification, if you'll forgive me. The Clinton administration did contemplate the use of force, but decided, or the President decided, on the basis of views from his advisors, from his military advisors, his diplomatic advisors, that the costs would be so enormous in human life, in economic disruption, that it was not something worth doing. And so instead, in the Clinton administration, you had this turn to negotiations, to diplomacy. It led to an agreement. The agreement had its problems, but it did hold for 8 years. And in the end, it was a combination of US suspicions under a new president of what the North Koreans were doing and North Korean suspicions of US long-term intentions that led to the breakdown of the agreed framework. The Bush administration tried a tough line, and when that didn't work, it got involved with what were called the six-party talks, brokered by China, but I think originally an American suggestion anyway, which seemed to enjoy a certain degree of success. But there was a tendency on both sides to move the goalposts slightly, and in the end that came to nothing. Mr. Obama, I suspect, did not really know what to do, and so effectively just put the whole thing on hold. And Mr. Trump seems to be throwing out mixed messages, which must be confusing, at least, to the North Koreans. Sometimes he's going to deal with them in a diplomatic fashion. He could have a hamburger with Kim Jong-un, and other times it's fire and fury, and now apparently the threat of a nuclear attack on them.
So confusion in North Korea. Well, what about South Korea? Because he's turned his attention on them in far from flattering terms for an ally.
Indeed. One of the problems with the second Bush administration was that it ceased to support the South Korean approach of engagement, which had been successful in a limited way, but it had reduced tension and it had led the two Koreas to begin to work together in a way that had never happened before. If you told me when I was in Seoul in in the early 1980s, that one day South Korean cars would cross the demilitarized zone and there would be a train link between the two sides, I'd have said you were in fairyland. But that happened. And Mr. Bush, however, again, like the current president, thought of it in terms of being appeasement rather than a logical approach to dealing with the issue. Get to know each other, get familiar with each other, and hopefully bring down the tensions between you. And how you get out of this dilemma, I don't know, because if Mr. Trump takes action, as I indicated, it's South Korea that is first in the firing line, and South Korea is very, very vulnerable.
Dr. Jim Hoare, thank you so much for your time this afternoon.
Thank you.
Let's go to Richard Lister, who's in our Washington bureau, and of course Donald Trump and many people there are just assessing what options are now open.
They are, and I suppose that's going to come to a head at the UN Security Council in their emergency session in New York, which gets underway in just under an hour's time. Now, that session is really designed to send a message to North Korea that the international community is united in its opposition to the nuclear test that was carried out and the continued ballistic missile testing. But of course, while there may be some kind of boilerplate statement agreed by the members of the Security Council, there are deep divisions within the permanent membership as to what in concrete terms should be done here. Now, the US has made very clear it's pursuing the idea of much tougher sanctions. The EU has backed that up. So have the other members of the G7. But the Russian Deputy Foreign Minister said today that in his view, the sanctions against North Korea had reached the limit of their effectiveness. There is really no appetite from the Chinese or the Russians for more sanctions. And the Chinese in particular are concerned that if you push too hard on North Korea, then you end up with a chaotic, destabilized state that has all kinds of problems for the Chinese in terms of refugees and could eventually lead to the reunification of the Korean peninsula with South Korea in charge. And that means potentially American troops at the Chinese border. So the Chinese have no interest in destabilizing North Korea. And that leaves, as you say, the big question for the Trump administration, well, what now? And I don't think there are any good answers to that.
Richard, thank you.